here we go. Okay, so also want to acknowledge any veterans that are here watching, and I want to acknowledge your service to the country. And at the evening service this evening, I'll have a prayer to share for the veterans. The blessing for Torah study, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this week, the portion is Chayei Sarah, and it is one of the few portions in the entire Torah that's named after a person. And it is the only portion, I believe, named after a woman. So we had the portion Noah, and you can argue also that there are two portions in the Torah that are named for people who are non-Israelite people. Noah, this is Noah, he's 10 generations before Abraham. You can argue that the covenant that God established between Abraham and Sarah and their future descendants is our covenant, whether we're born into it or we convert into it, and that Noah preceded that. So you can argue that Noah is a non-Israelite. And of course, Jethro, Moses's father-in-law, there is a portion in the book of Exodus named for him, in which we find none other than the 10 commandments in that portion. So I think the names of the portions says a lot, and the fact that there are two non-Israelites that merit a name of a portion says a lot about what the Torah is about. And the fact that we have a portion named for a woman also adds to that. Now, the deceptive part is that the portion is called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah. And of course, it begins with her death. So I want to read the first verse and highlight again the challenging or troubling part, or the frustrating aspect of the English translation, because it leaves a lot from the Hebrew missing, and we can't get a true sense of why the rabbis would be commenting in the way that they do because of the way the English translates. So I'm going to read the first sentence. Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah. Sorry, on page 127 in the Eitz Chaim. It's chapter 23 in the book of Genesis, whatever edition of Chumash or Bible you're looking at. Again, Chayei Sarah. Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah, me'ah shana, ve'esrim shana, ve'sheva shanim, shnei Chayei Sarah. The English translates it, Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. Okay, so straightforward in the English, but if I were to translate the Hebrew literally, the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, the years of Sarah's life. Okay, now you have a lot, the word for year, shana or shnei, the years of, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 times in the sentence. Chayim, life, in its form as Chayei, the life of Sarah. Chayim, it's one of those words that is a plural word, whether it's in plural or singular. Like fish in English, right? It's one fish, two fish. Chayei, so the life of Sarah. So Chayei Sarah, the word Chayei is twice in a sentence. So years 4 times, Chayim 2 times. But in the English kind of smooths it out. But the Hebrew is the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, the comma, the years, because you can do a comma there because of the cantillation mark under Sheva Shanim. That cantillation mark there serves the purpose of a comma. The years of Sarah's life. Okay, now the question for the rabbis who always read the Torah very carefully, almost with a magnifying glass, to see and comment on any unusual phrasing or spelling or use of the Hebrew. So that now seeing that Sarah's life is explained as being 127 years, but saying 100 years and 20 years and 7 years raises a question for the rabbis. Why does the Torah say that? Why does it tell us that? Because in the English, 127 years, that's the normal way of saying how somebody's age. You wouldn't say, I'm 100 years and 20 years and 7 years old. Or I wouldn't say I'm 50 years and 80 years old. Okay, and 8 years, 50 years and 8 years old. I wouldn't say that. You say I'm 58, you wouldn't even say years. Okay, so now in Hebrew phrasing, you add shana. It's a little bit more formal to add shana, or in asking like ben kama ata. That's the normal way of asking how old are you. Ben kama or bat kama at or ata. Ani ben, I am, it's Ani ben chamishim ushmona. I'm going to get the grammar wrong, and my father's going to comment. Ben chamishim ushmona shana. You can say shana or shanim, or just chamishim v'shmona without adding a year to it. So just 58. Okay, so that's how you would answer it in modern Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, you add the shana or shanim to it, but you certainly don't break it up in the way it's broken up here. So for that, we have the comment down below the line on verse 1, 127 years. In the words of the Midrash, Sarah, and again, they don't explain it to us why the Midrash did it this way, but I just did because of the way the Torah breaks it up. Sarah, so why 100 years and 20 years and 7 years? Sarah retained the innocence of a 7-year-old when she was 20, and the beauty of a 20-year-old when she was 100. Okay, so that's why for the rabbis, the Torah broke it up like that. So it's clear that we needed to learn something special, something unique about Sarah, as opposed to any other 127-year-old woman, as if that might have been common at that time, who knows. But by breaking it up like that, it allows the rabbis to teach this beautiful lesson about Sarah and Sarah's character, both her physical character and her personality. So she's as beautiful at 100 as she was at age 20, and she's as innocent at age 20 as she was at age 7. So to tell us more about who this Sarah was, because really we don't know much about her. We know that she left home with Abraham, so she agreed to go with him on the journey from Haran to the land of Canaan. And we know that she insisted that Abraham marry her maid, and then became jealous over that. So we know a little bit of her jealous streak. And what else do we know about her? That's essentially all. And she laughed when she heard that she was going to be giving birth in a year's time. So you might say, just from those, that Sarah is a difficult woman, or perhaps you could say she's an average woman who, when dealing with issues in her life, she acts as any average person would to circumstances like that. She would be jealous that hear how easy it was for Abraham to make Hagar conceive, whereas they together they've been infertile, making it clear that Sarah is the infertile one, not Abraham, so that she becomes jealous of that. But that's normal. Any woman would react in that way. And then to hear when you're 90 years old that you're going to get pregnant by this strange person coming to your tent, well, you would naturally laugh at that too. So, right. So Susan adds that other. That's right. So Abraham ordered her to prepare food for these angels, and she did that without complaining about that too. So it's the other two aspects that kind of highlight the nature of her personality, and yet the rabbis don't see that, but rather want us to see this in this comment to her age here about how beautiful she was, and also a comment that I mentioned last week about Heinika Vanim Sarah, that she suckled many children, that served as a blessing for her late in life pregnancy and childbirth, that all mothers in the land at the time brought their babies to be nursed by Sarah, so that their children could be physically blessed by Sarah, by actually nursing at her breast, that they would ingest this special blessing that was given to Sarah. So the rabbis, in normal rabbinic fashion, forget about or whitewash over flaws in the characters' personalities, and teach instead, and raise the characters up to this pedestal, teach about how great these characters were. Okay, so I wanted to point out that famous midrash. It's a very famous midrash about Sarah's age. Now, the commentary also has for us in the couple paragraphs leading up to that, kind of introducing what that portion was. Right. So Jan also said to me privately, didn't God direct Abraham to listen to Sarah? Yes, but that was more about God's plan, knowing that the covenant is going to go through Isaac, not through Ishmael. So listen to Sarah, despite her jealousy of Hagar and Ishmael, that it's part of the bigger plan that there's going to be this covenant that's going to be between Abraham, Sarah, and their child Isaac. So not necessarily more about Sarah's personality, but more about the bigger picture that Abraham couldn't see yet. So I wanted to.
So some say that that's because she had some element of prophetic vision that.
It's possible
that maybe Abraham at that moment did not have.
Right. So that would go to the extreme to take what looks like jealousy, a fit of jealousy in that moment, and to understand it instead as prophecy. And we'll see that later in a couple of portions when Rebecca has Jacob dress up like Esau, where it looks like it's all about deception and playing a game on Isaac, but the same thing, Rebecca knows that the covenant is meant to go to Jacob next and not Esau. So you take something that from the story looks like a bad thing, jealousy on Sarah's part, deception on Rebecca's part, and transforming it, as the rabbis do, into a positive. That also the same thing about Jacob, why he played along, why is he lying to his father and getting the blessing? No, because Jacob, being the next in line, had this vision, and he knew that he was within his right to do this in order to get the blessing. So so just another way of the rabbis taking the story and turning it upside down and telling us This is the way we're supposed to understand the story. Don't read it in the superficial way. You got to read it in this bigger way. And so, this parsha marks the transition from one generation to the next. It begins with Sarah's death and concludes with Abraham's. But its major theme is arranging a marriage for Isaac, the effort to find the right wife and partner so that the special tradition of Abraham and Sarah will continue beyond their lifetimes and the life of their son. So we'll get to that story of finding a wife for Isaac in just a moment. Although the Torah never explicitly makes the connection, many commentators connect Sarah's death with Isaac's narrow escape from the tragedy at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, because it follows immediately after that in the narrative, right? Just like last week, when we talked about the beginning of the portion Vayera, and we had to understand why God came to visit Abraham at that moment, at the heat of the day. What was Abraham doing in the shade of his tent, if not recuperating from the circumcision, which we had just read about a few verses before? And again, a haftarah is in the way here. If you're looking at this on page 127, page 126 is the end of this very lengthy haftarah from last week's portion. So it gets in the way of what we really read about last. The end of chapter 22 is introducing us to Rebecca and the genealogy. So that's just a parenthetical note, verses 20 to 24. Really what happened was, verse 19, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Okay, so they came back to Beersheba from Mount Moriah. Now, if the mountain Moriah here in the story of the binding of Isaac is the Mount Moriah that is where the temple stood in Jerusalem, then going to Beersheba from Jerusalem is a long trip. If you do it by car today, it's a couple hours. But if it's by caravan or just riding your camel or your donkey, it's a few days. So if you're going kind of south and then west, you're going through Bethlehem and Hebron, and then you're cutting through the Judean desert to get to Beersheba. So it is a lengthy trip. But that's so the Midrash makes a connection between the end of that story and Sarah's death. According to one legend, our commentary continues. According to one legend, Sarah is told that Abraham has killed Isaac at God's command. Believing it, she dies on the spot. So she, all this time waiting for a child, miraculously gives birth to a child. He grows up, and Abraham takes him on this mission, and then he kills him. Then Sarah's life ends right there. She dies of a broken heart. Or one commentator sees her death, even after learning that Isaac has survived, as an inability to live in a world as dangerous and unreliable as she has found this world to be, a world where life hangs by such a fragile thread. And it says Zornberg there. It's Aviva Zornberg, who's a well-known and very into psychological insights of Torah portions, and has written books about each of the books of the Torah. So Aviva Zornberg, quite the teacher of Torah, based in Jerusalem, but I think born in Scotland. And was a professor of English before she became a Bible professor and teacher. Her death. So in other words, the death here is not preceded by an explanation of why she died, because Abraham, we're told, is old and then he dies, and Isaac is getting old and then he dies. So and then in the genealogical lists from Abraham to Noah, and then from Noah to Abraham, so and so was born at such and such age, had children, and then such and such age they died. So without knowing anything else, that they reach a particular age and they die. So here, because there's no reason, it wasn't preceded by she grew old or something like that. That's another reason why the rabbis develop this connection between what happened just a few verses before with the binding of Isaac. Okay, so we have what comes next is so she dies, and Abraham needs to have a burial plot for it. And it's no different today than it was 3,600 years ago. When someone dies, you need a place to bury them. And so Abraham goes to, so she dies in Hebron, which is fascinating because the last thing we heard before the parenthetical genealogy of Rebecca is that Abraham goes to Beersheba. So, and I said, and it says here in the Torah that she dies in Hebron. Is Abraham with her? The last we heard, he's in Beersheba. Beersheba to Hebron. If we look at the map in the back of the Eitz Chaim, Beersheba to Hebron. Well, you're not going to be able to see it too well on my, if I hold up this map here. So it might not be worth it to do this. No, you can't really see it. You just trust me that Hebron to Beersheba is this distance between my fingers, and that distance is perhaps, that's as the crow flies, it's like 40 miles, but you can't travel from Hebron to Beersheba as the crow flies because you're going down mountains. So it's a long distance, and that raises another interesting point. How did Abraham get from Beersheba to Hebron? Was he with Sarah when she died or not? But clearly, that's a question that remains unanswered. But he clearly is taking care of her death, and he wants to get a burial plot, and he buys the plot. So here, if we go to page 129, let's just turn to page 129, beginning with verse 11. No, my Lord, hear me. He's talking to Ephron, who's the head of the clan, the family clan that's outside of Hebron. I give you the field and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed low before the people of the land and spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, if only you would hear me out, let me pay the price of the land, accept it from me that I may bury my dead there. And Ephron replied to Abraham, saying to him, my Lord, do hear me, a piece of land with 400 shekels of silver. What's that between you and me? Go and bury your dead. Abraham accepted Ephron's terms, right? It doesn't sound like it's terms. It sounds like Ephron wants to give the land, but it's like this Middle Eastern kind of giving and negotiation that's taking place here. And he just mentions the price, like 400 shekels. What's the big deal? We're good friends here. It's nothing to give you this land that's worth 400 shekels. Please take it. And Abraham, knowing how much the land is worth then, 400 shekels, is not going to take that for free. He's going to pay that price, but he doesn't negotiate. Oh, 400 shekels, sure, then you won't mind receiving 200 shekels in return. Abraham doesn't say that. He doesn't make it into a negotiation. He takes this exorbitant price, this 400 shekels, and accepts it and pays it. Abraham accepted, verse 16, Ephron's terms. Abraham paid out to Ephron the money that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver at the going merchant's rate. So the commentary points out an interesting question about this. So below the line here on 129, Ephron might be pretending to give Abraham the land while hinting at a steep price for it. Such bargaining seems devious and hypocritical. However, custom may have deemed it dishonorable to sell ancestral land, but acceptable to give it as a present to a close friend who presumably would give you a present of equal value. Okay, so that's comment number one, just about this, what looks like unseemly negotiation or giving of land. Although Abraham, now here's the point, although Abraham has God's promise, onto 130 now, below the line, that the land will belong to his descendants, it's important for him to pay full price for it, right? So it gets back to chapter 12, when God told Abraham and Sarah, get up and go to the land that I will show you. It's going to be yours. And then Abraham walks around the land as if he's taking it for him in possession. And that the commentaries point out there that by the act of walking the land that he did in chapter 12, kind of showed that he's taking the land, claiming ownership of the land. So God promised it to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah walk the land, so it's theirs. Why does he have to buy it? And then also Jacob buys some land too, outside of Shechem, a little bit later as well. Why do they have to buy it if it's given to them? So here it's pointing out for any kind of argument, possibly, that that future generations might have of non-Israelites with Israelites. Hey, this land isn't yours. You claim that God promised it to you. Well, we could argue back, well, we bought the land, so it's ours. It's kind of like what the early Zionist pioneers and settlers from the late 1800s until the establishment of the state of Israel did, where they bought land. They bought land from the Ottomans, who were the Ottoman Empire that was in charge of the land of Israel until 1917. So they kept buying land, and then that way nobody could argue. We own this land. We didn't take it from anybody. We didn't take it from out from under them. We bought the land fair and square from the Ottomans. So that was the policy and of the early Zionists to ensure rightful ownership of the land of Israel. So here, taking the Zionists set the first Zionist, the Yishuv, the settlement of the land of Israel, taking their example from Abraham himself. Okay, now we get to chapter 24, which to this point is will be the longest chapter so far in the Torah, which gets to a couple of questions as to why it is the longest chapter. So chapter 24 begins, Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Beirach et Avraham bakol. So I just want to point out just one thing about bakol, that Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. In Hebrew, bakol. So in Birkat HaMazon, if you do the full Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, there are three versions of the word kol that come up in a prayer: bakol, mikol, and kol, responding to these blessings. So it's a reference in the Birkat HaMazon, and I'm just pulling it out from the Siddur, so I can. Just 1 second. Just a second. There it is. Yes. So there's I'm in the weekday Siddur, Sim Shalom, just to get this. When you have there's a list of harachamans in the Birkat HaMazon, and you have one harachaman Yishlach lanu et Eliyahu Hanavi. That's part of the Birkat HaMazon, and then there's a few other prayers, like blessing the people who are at the table. And Vivarech Kamosheni Barchu Avotenu, as our ancestors were blessed, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, Bakol, Mikol, Kol. Ken yavarech otanu kulanu yachad bivracha shelema v'noma amen. So bakol mikol kol is a reference to the 3 times that God blessed the patriarchs. Here, bakol, right here, chapter 24, verse 1, God blessed Abraham within all things. And then he'll bless Isaac the same way, mikol, from all things, and kol, just all things. So that's just a reference to how the patriarchs were blessed. And just as they were blessed with all things, when we say the blessing after the meal, we want to be sure that we will be blessed with all things too. All right, so that was just a tangent. And so Abraham's blessed with everything, but the question, of course, is the main thing is this covenant and the promise of descendants. So he has Isaac, but for there to be descendants beyond Isaac, Isaac needs to be married. And so this chapter 24, is all about how Abraham asks his senior servant, Eliezer, to go and find a suitable bride for Isaac. So, and Isaac and Eliezer takes upon himself that mission. Instead of finding a bride for Isaac among the inhabitants of the land of Canaan already, Abraham has him go back to the home country where some family members still are, and that also teaches a lesson about who makes an appropriate couple, people that have similar backgrounds, similar cultures, similar history. That's one way to ensure success in a marriage, is similar backgrounds, not necessarily success today, but for the Torah, that seems to be an idea, just like Jacob runs away from Esau to the home country and finds Rachel and Leah there. But there are other models of marriage in the Torah. Joseph marries an Egyptian woman, and Ephraim and Manasseh are born from that marriage, who become tribes of Israel. Moses, of course, finding a Midianite woman when he runs away from Egypt after killing the taskmaster, and ending up in the Midianite priest's home with 7 daughters there, marries Zipporah. So there are examples of marriages of Israelites with non-Israelite women, but here is one example that perhaps teaches the lesson of endogamy, the fancy word for marrying within your own tribe or within your own people. So there's a comment here about this mission that, where did it go? Eliezer, page 132. Yes, okay. I want to look at page 132 to comment on a couple of things here. Page 132, which is chapter 24, verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and set out, taking with him all the bounty of his master. And he made his way to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down by the well outside the city at evening time, the time when women come out to draw water. And he said, so quote, so he's praying at this well at evening time. O Lord God of my master Abraham, grant me good fortune this day and deal graciously with my master Abraham. Here I stand by the spring as the daughters of the townsmen come out to draw water. Let the maiden to whom I say, please lower your jar that I may drink, and who replies, drink, and I will also water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have decreed for your servant Isaac. Thereby shall I know that you have dealt graciously with my master. It seems to be at just reading it once like this, not an unusual kind of prayer. You know, I came all this way. My master sent me on this mission. Here I am arriving at the village where I'm supposed to be, where family members are. Please, God of my master Abraham, please let this mission come into fulfillment. And he adds a condition. I'd like the woman, I'll know that the mission is fulfilled if a woman comes and offers drink, not just to me, but to my camels as well. It doesn't seem like there's anything untoward about that. But below the line, if you looked at this on page 132, where it says 12 and following, some of the sages criticize the servant Eliezer for his prayer. Conceivably, an unsuitable young woman might have come along to offer him water. Furthermore, although miracles do happen, a person may not demand a miracle. Now, I'm not so sure that Eliezer is demanding a miracle here, but he's pleading with God that there should be. So, because he says in the Hebrew on the top of 133, Hakrena lefanai hayom. The na there, please, is a kind of a formal, may it be your will kind of word. So it's not let it happen or cause it to happen, but please make this happen. So I wouldn't say demanding, but he is praying for a miracle. Like, here I am at the well, and perhaps I'm not going to do any work to kind of like ask around and see who's going to be suitable. He is asking God to present someone, and of course Rebecca is the first one to show up. So perhaps that's why they're critical that perhaps Eliezer's lazy here and leaving it up to God to do this. And the Hebrew kind of highlights this a little bit. If you look at the very last line on 132, the very first word of verse 12. So whatever edition of Chumash you have, the very first word of verse 12 is Vayomar, and he said. But the cantillation mark on Vayomar is a very unusual cantillation mark. It's called a shalshelet. It appears only 4 times in the entire Torah. And it's sung in a way that emphasizes the word itself, that we're supposed to stop what we're doing and really pay attention to what's happening. So the way I do a shalshelet, the way I would sing this word is, so Vayomar normally would have like a comma, the comma cantillation mark for it. Vayomar, and he said, comma, quotation mark following. Instead, it's Vayomar. Okay, so that's, and I'm not a singer, but that's anybody who reads Torah, who does the shalshelet, does it like that, emphasizing it. Like the tune does this thing 3 times, shalosh, 3, shalshelet, a three thing. So there's emphasis there. So if we're kind of like nodding off as the Torah is being read, and then the Torah reader does this shalshelet, well, you might wake up and hear, whoa. So what's going on with this word? So the cantillation mark highlights for us this unusual thing. We have a prayer here by a non-Israelite. That's interesting in and of itself. And what is this prayer? This prayer, is it an acceptable form of prayer? Well, the rabbis would say, the rabbis would say that it is inappropriate to pray for a miracle. And they have a section in the Talmud, the very first section of the Talmud is known as brachot, that if you, essentially if we would translate that experience into modern times, if you see an ambulance drive by as you're going home with the sirens blaring, or a fire truck with its sirens blaring, as it drives by you on your way home, you are not supposed to pray may the ambulance or fire truck not be going to my house. You're not supposed to pray a prayer like that because the ambulance and fire truck are on their way already. Whether you like it or not, it's going where it's going. And a prayer for may the ambulance and fire truck not be going is that you're asking for a miracle to happen because the event, it's already determined what house is on fire or what medical emergency is happening where. So you cannot ask God to perform a miracle to make it so that the ambulance and fire truck are not going to your house. So this prayer, may God bring a woman to this well who's going to be asking if I'd like to have water and my camels would like to have water, is asking for a miracle to happen. You got to let things just happen on their own, and you can't pray for miracles like that to happen, which of course calls into question a prayer that we pray every time we read Torah, and that is to ask for God to heal the sick. You might argue that that might be asking for a miracle, and you can kind of, well, it may be determined that already if the person is sick, what's going to happen to them, that they're going to get better or they're not. But you can also say, well, there is still the hope of some intervention, and that saying this prayer for those who are ill to get better is not, it's like a slippery slope. You're walking a fine line here, but it's okay to say that prayer because you're also asking not just for the person who is ill to have positive attitude or have the willpower to keep on fighting, but you're also asking for doctors and nurses and caregivers to expend as much energy as possible on the healing of this person. So there, some prayers, though it may seem like you're praying for a miracle, are understood as not praying for a miracle. And so there's that emphasis about Eliezer's prayer. And of course, as soon as he's done praying, verse 15, he had scarcely finished speaking when Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, which this genealogy we should remember from the end of chapter 22, that parenthetical note after the binding of Isaac, it's repeated right here. The maiden came out with her jar on her shoulder. The maiden was very beautiful, a virgin whom no man had known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. The servant ran toward her and said, "Please let me sip a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and she quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and let him drink. When she had let him drink his fill, she said, "I will also draw for your camels until they finish drinking." Quickly emptying her jar into the trough, she ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all the camels. Ta-da! Miracle. Rebecca's here, and there Eliezer knows, as it says. Now, just a couple things about this. According to the rabbis, Rebecca had to be 3 years old at this point right here for all the numbers and the ages to work when we read about Isaac and Rebecca in next week's portion and the following portions. So it has to be that Rebecca's 3 years old here. Clearly, 3-year-olds don't go to prayers of petition are part of our tradition. Yes, there's a difference between a petition and asking for a miracle. So the intermediate prayers, just to get back to praying for a miracle versus asking for something which isn't a miracle, all the intermediate blessings of the Amida, which we say on weekdays 3 times a day, are petitionary prayers, asking for the Messiah to come, asking for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. Yeah, are you asking for a miracle there? There's a promise that Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt. There's a promise that the temple is going to be rebuilt. There's a promise that if we follow the covenant, that will be prosperous and that will be blessed. So all of these things that we're praying for in those petitionary prayers are kind of like asking God to fulfill those promises, as opposed to something out of thin air that you're asking, like, may I pass the medical boards tomorrow, or the law school entrance exam, right? That's a little bit different. There's no promise from God that you would pass that. And so that's the distinction that the rabbis are making. This petitionary prayer for moderns is understood that you're not just asking God to do this for you, you're asking to be partners with God to make this happen. Okay?
Is it more about a particular outcome that we don't ask for? I'm getting a little tripped up with the whole
So
miracle thing. It's more like
a
I could
miracle
say,
thing. So it's like if you're a sports fan and it's the 7th game of the World Series, and the game has been played already, and you have not been able to watch the game, but you wake up in the morning before turning on the news or Facebook or anything like that, and you're praying to God, oh, may the Phillies have won the World Series. Well, it's already determined. The game was played the night before. So that's the miracle prayer that you're asking. That is a prayer in vain, because the event happened already. The fire truck and ambulance, the event is happening, and you're asking for a diversionary tactic that will be a miracle, because the fire or the medical emergency is already happening, and you can't pray for it to stop. So yes, so a prayer that would be a prayer in vain, that's the prayer that turns out, if it's in a form of asking for a miracle, that is not allowed. But a prayer in which that reflects a lengthy process, like recovering from an illness, or prosperity in livelihood, or the future of the Jewish people, all of these are processes that are currently happening. You can certainly pray over the course of the process, however long it takes, that there should be a successful outcome, because the outcome hasn't been determined yet. Okay, so that's the thing. So just a note here, why the rabbis might sound ridiculous that they make Rebecca 3 years old at this point, because of ages, how we're introduced to them later on in the Torah. The rabbis who do the counting of ages then, and going back to this point have to say that Rebecca's 3 years old. Trust me on that. You can look it up later, but Rebecca's 3 years old. So that's the astonishing thing here, is that a 3-year-old child is holding a large jar, a jug, to be able to draw water. Usually toddlers don't do that. And how the miracle that happens here is that based on the Hebrew, the verse 16, V'hana'ara tovat mar'eh ma'od, the maiden was very beautiful, Betula, a virgin, Ve'ish lo yada'ah, whom no man had known. Well, you kind of hope that if she's 3 years old. But Tered ha'ayana, she went down to the spring, but Temale chada, her jug was filled, Vata'al, and either she raised it up, or the jug itself was raised miraculously. So she might not have been strong enough to actually hold a full jug of water, but the miracle was that the jug kind of did it by itself. It lowered into the water, it filled with water, and came up by itself. So that's kind of a more fanciful kind of midrash, and the rabbis do compose fanciful midrashim like that as well. So I kind of take that with a grain of salt, because some of these stories, they're kind of nice as midrashim, as children's stories, but did the rabbis really intend for us to understand this, to take it that seriously? It's one thing to understand from Sarah's age, written as 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, to teach something about her character and her moral and religious personality. That's okay. You can allow that and say, okay, this is what the lesson that the rabbis want us to learn from that unusual phrasing. But to learn that Rebecca was 3 years old, do we have to understand that she's 3 years old and that this miracle happened? There are some who would say yes, we have to take that seriously too. I would say there's no law that we're learning from this midrash, from this story, from this legend, and it just adds to kind of the mythic, epic quality of this whole family story of Abraham and Sarah down through Joseph and his brothers. That there are some unusual things that happen in the story, plot twists, that things kind of work out in the end based on things that happen earlier in the story. They're happening again later in the story. So all of that, yes, it's all brilliant narrative, and perhaps there's a force working behind the scenes. We can all understand that. But the idea that she's 3 years old, for me, that's going a bit too far, and I don't think we need to understand that as part of the story. But in the couple minutes that we have left, the question is that all this happens, and then Eliezer meets Rebecca's family, and then he tells them everything that happened until that point. And instead of the Torah just saying, Eliezer told them everything that happened to that point, the Torah actually takes the time to have Eliezer repeat the story. It takes the time to say all of these verses again, which makes this chapter into a lengthy chapter. And so another lesson that rabbis teach is that there aren't wasted words in the Torah. The Torah is very sparse sometimes in teaching, in telling stories and in teaching law. Why spend the time here on repeating the details of the story? And Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who this year is part of the Hadar Institute in New York, and they publish a Devar Torah every week on email. So Yitz Greenberg is writing these email Divrei Torah every week, and he highlights for us something that a great rabbi from a couple 100 years ago, Israel Salanter, taught, that the Torah's main goal was to develop an ideal human being. So you need law to develop the idea of what is an ideal human being, and you need values too. And so this story, this lengthy story, highlights the ideal of kindness and compassion. And to take the time to highlight Rebecca's compassion and her willingness to go along with Eliezer to meet this unknown man and to marry him and to agree to be part of this covenantal family, all of that shows her faith and her kindness and compassion. And for that, the Torah was willing to spend the extra time to highlight that message. So any other questions or comments about the Torah before, about the port? Yes, Jan, go ahead, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
So my question is, you talked about how you can't really have a prayer for something that's already kind of predetermined.
Right.
And so when Abraham is talking to Eliezer, he's saying that these angels are going to go, or angel, maybe it's singular, is going to go ahead and kind of set it all up. So if it is already kind of set up, then isn't that second, when Eliezer does that prayer, isn't that kind of like extra?
Right. So verse 7 on 131, the Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, who promised me on oath, saying, I will sign this land to your offspring. He will send his angel before you, and you will get a wife for my son from there. Yeah. So we don't. So the story doesn't. The Torah doesn't include the details of the story in which Eliezer sees that angel. So that's an interesting point. Where is that angel? how do we know? Well, we kind of know that everything was set up. Well, for the rabbis, the patriarchs have this inherent power in them. Once God has talked to them and God has either instituted the covenant or re-emphasized it with the subsequent generations, then that bestows upon them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this extra power of foresight. And you could argue Joseph has it too with his ability to interpret dreams. So yes, so they get extra power. So, but Abraham has that power to invoke God and the angel, but Eliezer doesn't. So, and so that's why it's only some rabbis, not all rabbis. That's why some rabbis argue about Eliezer's prayer. Was he within his rights to pray that way? And are we supposed to learn about prayer from Eliezer? And we are supposed to learn not to do a prayer like Eliezer did. Is that a bad thing? I don't think Eliezer comes across as a good guy in this story, but for the rabbis, they just want to highlight, yeah, he's a good guy, but the prayer that he said, because we know how to say prayers today, wasn't exactly the right thing to do. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. And we have Minyan this evening at 7:30. We have tomorrow morning at 8:45 Minyan, and tomorrow evening as well. We have another Minyan because there's going to be a religious committee meeting tomorrow night. So look to the email that I sent a little bit earlier this morning for other opportunities for connecting on Zoom and with the shul this week. Have a good
I
rest.
think Elizabeth also had a question.
Oh,
It's
Elizabeth,
okay.
did you?
It's okay, the class is done.
Okay.
It
Wait,
was-
we can save it for next time.
I'll save it for another time.
Okay, that'll be fine.
Jonah Yashikoa.
Okay, Bruchim to you. Have a good
Thank you
day,
so
everybody.
much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.